Hi, Rick. Welcome. So nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well.
Let me turn up the volume here so I can hear you properly. Yeah, I'm so glad you could do this today. Thank you for doing it on a Sunday afternoon. Um, 'Cause you work all week, so I'm glad I caught you this weekend. I'm so glad you agreed to do this. I know people would love to hear from you. And I just want to say, thank you again. Thank you for everything you're doing. It's been a long 4 years that you've been receiving, and it's a great deal of devotion. And thank you for your generosity of time to do all this, journey into the unknown. And so, arrival, and now soul in the driver's seat, A Course in Miracles for the New Age. So, thank you.
You're welcome.
So, this is about you sharing your experiences with soul in the driver's seat. I remember you saying that you were looking forward to receiving the material all over again in a different way, just like the people receiving the installments each month. So, you know,
Well, yeah, I love how it's happening. It comes out once a month and everybody has access to it, free access, and they can go there anytime they want to, day or night, 24/7, and they can read and reread. And then I just love that. I just think that's really just amazing. And it's something that everybody can do together. you know, uh, Within our different time zones, we're all kind of doing the same thing that month. So I just think that it's just an amazing thing.
mhm.
So thank you
Yeah.
for doing it. I
Oh,
know it
yeah.
took a lot of work.
Well, here we are putting it out once a month. I mean, there's so much in it. Each verse on its own could be like you could meditate on that for a day, you know? So I'm curious, the reason we're having the conversation is because I'm sure people would love to hear how it, speaks to you and your experience with it, and, anything that pops forward for you, or you agree with or don't agree with.
Hmm. Well, it's like you say, it is very dense. There's a lot in each sentence, and
Mhm.
then that's true. Um, yeah, it's just a wealth of information, which is why I think it's so good to have it in digestible chunks, because I think to have it any other way would be really in the realm of too much.
Mhm. Mhm.
So this way, there's a lot there, and you have a whole month to kind of digest it before you're ready for more.
Mhm.
Because with each part, there's more to digest, and there's a lot there. So I just think that the way that it's coming out is just perfect,
Yeah,
considering that.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. And I assume, well, I hope people are taking the time to spend with it. Although you probably wouldn't be surprised at the number of messages or emails I get saying, well, why can't you put out more? Why it's going to take a long time. And I say, bless you. Well, this is just how it's being done. That's how it came, and it's how it feels right to do it. So I think, well, what's really fascinating for me is that this book is really the primary audience it's meant for is people who have never picked up A Course in Miracles or A Course of Love or A Journey into the Unknown, which Jesus calls the seminal trilogy, the completion of that trilogy with Journey and Arrival. But this is meant to be for anybody who's never read any of those books, never even heard of them, because the language is everyday. So I find that's one of the reasons why it's so dense, is because it's saying a lot, but in simple language, and explaining things in a way that's very clearly accessible. I mean, I marked a couple of, I'm going back to chapter one, unless you wanted to jump into something you wanted to talk about. We could just kind of step through the two chapters that are out there already, the two installments, chapter 1 and chapter 2, and see what comes up. I printed them
Okay.
off. Okay, so did you have something marked you wanted to talk about in chapter 1?
No, I just feel like it help me as a reader. It helps me to understand my brain and how my brain works.
Mm.
And as the book goes on, then of course we're going to be helped to understand our souls and how those work.
Mm.
Because really, I mean, a lot of us are just blind to everything. We don't understand ourselves as we don't understand what's going on around us or ourselves. And this soul thing, people write about it in songs and you can find it in a movie. And
That's right.
it's a nice word and it's an interesting concept, but do you really know what it is or do you really know about yours?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's what I like, that this is going to help me as a reader to put those pieces together and really have a really good understanding, better than ever before.
Right, right. And soul is actually quite a simple word. I know you mentioned a movie. There was a movie that was a Disney Pixar movie that was all about, it was called Soul. And people kind of got a feel for what that is. And, I thought it was pretty interesting and pretty accurate. So here we are with this book. And okay, so one of the things I marked was on verse 6 of chapter 1, when it talks about being a very small part of something bigger. And this something bigger is what is known as source energy. Source energies. I love that the word energy comes in very early on, because that's really what we are. And science would say the same thing. It's energy, commonly known as God. And the figurative hand is commonly known as soul. This soul is your true self. And there are no two alike. So I love that. And I think a bit later on in chapter 1, in verse 14, it talks about um, soul as being divine oneness. I think it's actually verse 15, divine oneness. I think soul is a simpler word than oneness. That's kind of the big word.
Right. Hmm.
So when I read verse 8, I'd love to hear what you think of verse 8. Strengthening ourselves through adversity of all types is the only way to grow more of it. The it that I refer to is source energy. This is God. God is here to grow more of itself, the nature of which is benevolent care and concern for itself in the form of others. God is here to help itself grow. It grows through relationship each and every time love is chosen over fear. So what would you say to that when people say, what do you mean God's growing?
Oh, I
Love
know.
is growing. Isn't that an interesting? Right up front, tells you that.
That's a very old idea about God being something that's out in the sky somewhere. And he is very judgmental and he punishes if you don't do what he wants. And he may reward you if you have done something that he likes. So these are very old, primitive ideas about God that are probably tied into superstition, but they're very powerful and they're very prevalent today. I mean, they're still teaching these types of concepts about God in all of the major religions.
Right.
So, this idea of God being not unlike nature, not unlike anything that we see that is growing and changing every moment, really, um, that is a different idea of God, but it's one that does makes sense to me that it grows and changes like you and I grow and change, or like the trees and the plants grow and change.
Mhm.
It's no different.
Mhm.
So it's pretty revolutionary, really, because it's so different from what we have always been taught and what's being taught today, even.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of boiled it down to a very simple statement that we're here. Our purpose in being here is to grow more love, to grow more God, to grow more source energy. They use those words interchangeably. How you do that, there are billions of different ways. It can look different on the outside, but the ultimate real purpose is to grow more love, to grow more God. But I'm sure that'll be a revolutionary idea to a lot of people because God is supposed to be this omnipotent, all knowing, you know.
Right. Something that doesn't change and something that is outside of time.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that God is in time and is changing as well as being outside of
Right,
time,
right, right,
that's different.
right.
Yeah.
That's what's interesting. It's both somewhere, I think, a bit later in this chapter. Um, talks about time. I can't find it right now, but when we're talking about this oneness, I remember verse 14 says, the oneness within the multitude is growing and becoming more aware of itself. I mean, that's why I kind of feel this book, the timing of it, Rick, is really pretty interesting and very important because people are kind of asking questions, waking up and wondering what's really happening. Do you
I,
encounter that? I mean, you're a teacher, so you're with kids every day of the week. What are you noticing?
to me, when I look out on the world, I just see a lot of deterioration and
Hmm.
distrust and a lot of things that I didn't see when I was younger. So I think that things are kind of being paved for something new, something revolutionary to help all of us to deal with all the things that are going on in our own lives and in the world as at large. You were talking about time. I think there's a whole section on time in chapter 4.
There's
But
something,
again,
yeah.
this idea that, God is outside of time and inside of time, growing more of itself,
Mhm.
is really an interesting idea.
Yeah. Um, well, let's come back to the question I asked about, how you, well, whether you're noticing anything as you move around the world. But I think the time thing is mentioned in the last verse of chapter 1. Um, it says the overcoming process, that means overcoming ego, is known as awakening, a precious beginning of a process when a human discovers their true identity and operates from that understanding. So discovers soul, I guess you could say, their true identity, their true self. It is a convergence of the eternal with the temporary, divine identity and thought with the Christ mind marry the two states of timeless and time bound, completing the circle of life. And that's what you were talking about is both. God is both outside and inside of time. So that was pretty interesting. So I mean, to me, there's so many concepts introduced in chapter 1 already. Big thoughts, but in a very
Mhm.
simple way, not a way that your mind can kind of analyze and figure out, but a way that if you just let it kind of hang out with it, a verse at a time, there's so much that kind of becomes clearer.
There's this one phrase that's been in a lot of spiritual books and it says, there is no separation.
Right.
So if that's true, that there is no separation, then all of this that we're talking about today are more details about why that's true.
Hmm.
So I just think that that's interesting. It's just adding layers and layers and layers of details to something that was really simplistic
Hmm.
and hard to understand by itself. But then if you apply all of this new information to it, then it becomes easier to understand.
Right, right.
For me, for me.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And it's that whole notion of oneness is really what you're talking about, no separation. But what does that even mean? And what do you mean? I mean, I'm walking around separate from you. It's pretty obvious. That's the kind of thing that makes people stop and kind of read and think about it. Hopefully, hopefully. But it's not something I always go back to realizing this is something my mind is not going to understand. You know, it's an experience of it. So yeah, so I don't know. Can we just go back to I'm curious about how you feel this applies or you see it playing out, in terms of the people you're with every day when you're teaching. How old are these kids?
Oh, my students are this year they're 10th, 11th, 12th grade. So they're just turning 18 at the oldest. And then I think the youngest one is about 15. So
Mm-hmm.
15 to 18.
Hmm.
And they have mental health issues.
Right. Well, who
They were
doesn't in a way? But these children have particularly difficult issues, I know.
they were in regular schools, and then that wasn't working out. And then they offered them this opportunity to go to this. Basically, it's an alternative private school called a non-public school, and they take all of their classes with me. So it's kind of like a Little House on the Prairie kind of thing.
Mhm.
And then there's another teacher that has the same scenario across the hall,
Mm.
and they have clinicians there, so they have time with them as part of their day too. And they're going to be starting group therapy. But it's all about like taking accountability and understanding what's happening and their role in it. And so it's behavioral, but it's also just trying to be in the moment. And as teachers, we try to take the stress out of getting a high school diploma.
Mhm.
So I mean, it's got some stress in it, but it's nothing like what you'd find on a traditional campus. And really, it's a lot of parenting. It's just it's a lot of love, and we have stuffed animals, and the kids love those, and we have all kinds of things for them to feel happy and comfortable,
Mhm.
things to do on their breaks. They get a lot of break time, and they get rewards. They have fun Fridays where they get to go places sometimes. Like last Friday, they went to Japantown, and there's just a lot of that. So it's just kind of probably more parenting and love than anything else. And then it's got the school component and this therapy component. So that's what it's like.
Mm. So how does your understanding of soul in the driver's seat come into play?
Because I just see myself as they're not so much the teacher, but as the force of um, the divine, an instrument of the divine to help these kids. These kids are in my care for 6 hours, and so that's my job, is to care for them and nurture them in a loving way. It's not punitive at all, like you would find in other places. And so my understanding of myself, my different part, my human self and my soul, helps me to understand these kids who are very conflicted with their identity, their human identity, but they do respond to, positive things. And so
Mhm.
that's what we try to do.
Yeah, it sounds beautiful the way you described creating an environment that feels safe, even with things like stuffed animals, soft toys, the comfort. I mean, I can just imagine that, coming from you, the love and compassion, that kind of softness, you're creating a space for them. And in a way, I know we're describing this school you're teaching in as, they're pretty difficult cases. I mean, kids that couldn't make it in the regular system. But in some sense, I feel I need a soft, safe place to be. And where is that? We have to find it within ourselves. And in a way, soul, learning about soul and allowing soul to be in the driver's seat feels very similar to what you're doing for these children. Because I mean, I can get pretty scared. I mean, I surprise myself sometimes, waking up in the morning, feeling afraid, not really knowing why I'm afraid, that happens at times and it still happens. I mean, even before doing this conversation on Zoom, yeah, I'm not really the kind of person who likes being out there. You're probably not either. And I thought, okay, we'll let soul be in the driver's seat, and lead with the love. See, that's what you're doing. See, that's why I asked you the question, because I kind of guessed that's what you would say. You're providing an environment where there is this unconditional love. I mean, I don't know if there are many, or any environments in the world where a human being could be and experience unconditional love once they cease being a baby in arms.
But you're right, we all need it.
All of
And
us.
we need this information, and we need to be able to have that place in ourselves that's that kind
Right.
of soft place that doesn't have the harshness of our brains
Right, exactly. And
time.
and maybe when we give it to ourselves, or start there at least, we'll be able to give it to each other, you know?
Mhm.
That's what this book, I mean, that there's places that can be pretty direct, but it feels like a very compassionate kind of message, feels like a very encouraging, uplifting. And like you were saying about the kids in your class, it's mostly about teaching them accountability. Well, it's also about that. It's also about owning, our choice, my choice for whether I, move with fear or with love.
I feel like we need this book to ground us all. Everybody, we all need to be
Right.
grounded in truth, because in the world there's so much anger and
Oh yeah.
us versus them. There's a
Mhm.
lot of tribalism, and there's a lot of just not understanding anything. So we need a starting place so that we can
Mhm.
understand ourselves first, and then hopefully be able to have more understanding of
Right.
other people, as hard as that is sometimes.
It's so much easier to find someone else to blame, isn't it? I mean, that's really the thing. I think that's the probably we finally grow up when we realize that we're responsible for every single moment of our lives, in a very big way. And that's kind of scary. That's still scary, today sometimes. So I just wanted to go back to the end of chapter 1. I love how it says right at the very end, where divine identity and thought within. Why don't you read that, Rick? Have you got it in front of you?
I
Chapter
do.
1, chapter 1, verse 18.
18?
Yeah, just
Okay.
read the whole thing up, all the way to the end. Yeah.
Okay. 18. Human identity and human thought create an illusionary reality that covers up a true reality. They are merely symptoms meant and designed to be overcome. The overcoming process is known as awakening, a precious beginning of a process when a human discovers their true identity and operates from that understanding. It is the convergence of the eternal with the temporary. Human identity and thought create the illusion that someone is something they are not. Divine identity and thought with the Christ mind marry the two states of timeless and time bound, completing the circle of life. When a soul has gained enough maturity to take control from the body's natural operating system, the ego, then Christ has returned. Sanity has replaced irrational and insane thought and actions. This has already started happening across the land, one soul at a time. This is the second coming of Christ. This is Soul in the Driver's Seat, A Course in Miracles for the New Age, a guidebook for those who want to awaken and explore their own true identity, which will culminate in soul growth that will produce Christ, an operating system that reflects God and mankind. Let it be.
Amen. That's so beautiful. That really is a world I hope I live long enough to experience.
Me too. And we were talking at the beginning of this conversation about the concepts that are prevalent about God. And there also are concepts that are very prevalent about Christ. And this is a very different, new idea about Christ, the fact that you are Christ and you are learning to follow your divine or Christ self, and that Christ is God and mankind. So again, moving away from the idea that just that Christ was only in one individual. Now, this is telling us that we have this opportunity to, literally walk the earth as Christ because we are following our soul. So that's another new idea. So just in one chapter here,
Mhm.
we have two big, big, big new ideas.
Mhm. Very much so, yeah. And that idea of walking the planet as a divine human being isn't new, but it certainly hasn't necessarily been applied with the word Christ, especially when you consider people who have had a religious background, a Christian religious background. But yeah, no, I love that. And I remember in other places in Journey, Jesus referring to all of us as Christ, or Mother Mary referring to everyone as Christ. And so there was Jesus Christ, but we've missed the point that he came just to show us this one example. I mean, the Course of Love talks about that, um, and we sort of missed the memo, that the whole idea was that there would be billions of Christs walking on the planet. So you would be Rick Christ and I would be Christina Christ, and everybody would be a Christ. That would be but in some Eastern religions, like certainly in Buddhism, you know the word they use is bodhisattva. A bodhisattva is a being that is enlightened and chooses to stay on the planet, to walk hand in hand with other, their fellow human beings, and not just disappear. So in a way, for those of us who've done A Course of Miracles, A Course of Love, Journey, and so on, um, it's you go up the mountain, you undo the mind, you kind of go into the heart, you kind of go up the mountain, but this is about coming down off the mountain and living on the planet as a loving being, a being of love, of unconditional love. And I think there's more about unconditional love in the next chapter, but that's a phrase that it just, whenever I read it or see it anywhere, I think, wow, what a world that would be, you know, expression of unconditional love. But I think the world as we have been trained to be in would consider that silly, weak, unconditional love. And that's a hard thing to overcome in myself for sure, you know. So great. Well, thanks for reading that. Shall we bumble on to chapter 2 and see, did you mark anything? Did you want to talk about anything in chapter 2? So chapter 1 was called the introduction, and chapter 2 is called the basics.
I'm pulling it up here. I just think that this chapter really gives a good basic understanding of what it's like to be a human and how our brains work. And it talks about two dilemmas, uh, meaning two ways of thinking about the same thing. And this helped me to understand more about how my brain processes a lot of information. And then it also lets you know how your soul processes that information, but a lot of times we can't or are unable to understand that. We just understand what's apparent to us, which is how our brain is processing things.
Yeah. And this chapter has, I think, 26 verses. And I was thinking when I first when we put out installment 2 that you could take one verse each day and the whole of your month would be pretty occupied, sitting with these verses because there's a lot in each one. Yeah, those two dilemmas. We'll get to. I think the first one is, and everybody's going to say, "Well, I know that, fear versus love." But the issue isn't so much knowing it up here; it's feeling it and then being brave enough to actually respond in life that way. And I love how it gives you a really good refresher, as you were saying, for anybody who feels they already know that. So if I go to verse 5, some of these words are very familiar. What is not love is fear, and fear is not in itself real. Fear is simply a call for love. I mean, we've heard that over and over and over. However devastating it may be, it's still a call for love. However destructive it is, it's still a call for love. However much suffering it causes, it's still a call for love. Well, isn't that the most difficult thing in the world, to love that in the moment? It's easy enough from a distance of time or distance of space, but in the moment. And the next sentence is the one I had marked. Fear calls for love and rarely receives it. The best I've been able to do when it's been particularly hard is keep my silence, you know?
Yeah, know that it's happening and just sit with it. And sometimes the sitting with it can take months.
Right.
Yeah.
And in the moment, walking away from it sometimes. It takes walking away. Because if I stayed, I would be opening my big fat mouth and saying things that would not be unconditional love, you know?
Right. But you know what? You and I have talked about this before too. We need to love ourselves when we're in deep fear, and we need to just accept that that's what's happening right now. And we need to love ourselves even in that time. I
Absolutely.
have trouble. I have so much trouble with that.
Mm, mm.
Yeah.
I imagine at school, the kids are quite a challenge, for holding that kind of center. Yeah. So you're growing a lot more God as you work with that.
The kids, but with me, it's more the staff members.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's fair. That's fair.
So
That's so interesting. That's true. You know, this thing I said earlier about the only time I feel every human being experiences, and even that's not true of every single human being. But it's when you're a baby in arms to experience unconditional love, because nothing is expected of you. You get taken care of fully. But there's an interesting transition that happens also. And when I've had friends or people, even my sons when they when had children, is to notice at what point in the child's growth, what age, does the unconditional love kind of morph into the kind of love that is love, but you know better. You should have known better, that kind of evaluative thing. It's so interesting to notice when those things begin to happen. So, and as adults, I mean, observing myself all the time for the thoughts that come along and say, well, they should have, why didn't they? Or myself. It's the hardest thing for me is self-compassion. You know, that's the hardest thing. And as you said earlier, that's what it is. But if I go back to this verse, what fear usually receives is fear. Fear on top of fear is a recipe for disaster. And this explains many things in the world, small and large. Wouldn't that be amazing if people really understood this and put it into practice? That's what I'm trying to do my best to do, Rick.
Well, I think that if someone really wanted to, if they were motivated to, they could understand this and they could apply it with what they see, like even on the news.
Right.
And maybe it could help them to have a little more peace with what they're seeing, because what they're seeing might be very provocative to everybody who's watching. But really, that what we're doing though is we're adding energy to this thing, whatever that might be. But if one person here, one person there can take that reaction out and kind of have an understanding of what is happening, and just bless the situation and bless the people who are involved directly, that has great power for me,
Mhm.
because it helps me to not be so upset about whatever it is that I saw or heard.
Right.
So I think that this has the potential to help create a little bit of peace with readers if they can really understand it and apply it. And
Yeah.
I'm going to try to do it.
Oh, definitely. That's it's a full-time job, Rick. Noticing,
Yeah,
noticing and allowing myself, and for myself primarily, but for others too. I'm better at giving that kind of understanding and blessing to others than I am for myself, I think. So, do you find that too?
absolutely. Because I want to judge myself for when I was reactive. But and it takes a long time, months for me to say, that's where I was at that time, and I understand why I was reactive, and I am ready to move on, and I'm going to bless this individual that I was reactive with. But I can't, like, there was something that happened at school with another staff member, and I offered my hand. I said, nice, like, kind of a starting over thing. Nice to meet you. And that person refused to shake my hand. So I know that I don't have that kind of power where I can, fix it on the other person's end.
Hmm.
But on my side, it was over with,
Hmm.
right?
Right,
So
right.
I had to accept that that other person had the last say. And that's what the last say was. So, and that was hard because everybody wants a happy ending.
Well, it's my ego wants the last say, right?
Right.
And that's yeah, yeah. No, you're right. I think So even one of the things that helps me is recognizing that my ego just wants to be loved too. That's what it's doing all these and saying all these things for. It just wants to be loved.
Mhm.
So I don't know what Soul in the Driver's Seat would say about this. We're only at chapter 2, but yeah, Soul in the driver's seat doesn't mean the ego is gone. It means it's cuddled up in the back seat, quite happily being loved unconditionally and enjoying the ride, right? So
It's part of you. It's not something
exactly.
to try to wish away or anything like that. It's very much a big part of you. It's a big part of who you have been, and now it's going to be part of the new you as you blend in your soul.
Hmm.
And um, and that is different too, because that is kind of a new idea too, because there's been, other things that have said that have made people feel like they need to diminish the
Mm-hmm.
ego or not acknowledge it or something like that.
Hmm.
Um, in my experience, you have to acknowledge it, or
Yes,
it's going to be
yes,
acknowledged. Yeah, but
yeah,
I want to understand it better, right?
right, right. Understanding it better helps me make better choices, more loving choices. I'm not going to say better. I didn't mean to use that word, but more loving choices, which makes me feel more peaceful. And I think that's an important point you just raised. We're not trying to get rid of the ego. There's nothing wrong with the ego. And in some sense, a sense of humor comes into it for me because I have a very strong mind, and it's been a long process of decades, softening the mind and falling into the heart, and yet appreciation of the mind and the structure of the ego that has brought me here, and the celebration of it, and now the rest because soul is in the driver's seat, you know, but with appreciation and gratitude, not with, oh, thank God I got rid of the ego. It's not like that for me. And humor, meaning when I notice, a thought or I'm about to say something or have said it, um, just the sort of smile, like, oh, there I go again, that kind of a thing. And just it can be funny sometimes. Maybe you should ask Colin about that, but it can be funny sometimes. Yeah. At least funny to me. And I think a lot of it is what I say to myself, the ego. So fear versus love, there's so much in that, so much in that. Love is not against fear, but fear is against love. That was a big one for me, you know. Love is not against fear. Love is unconditionally loving of fear and says, oh, there you are again, fear. Thank you for keeping me safe because it's the fear that has kept me going before I understood about love. So thank you. But now you can rest. Here's a blankie. Here's a nice snack. You can get in the back of the car with me and cuddle up, because love is in the driver's seat. So is in the driver's seat. So that's kind of it helps me a lot remembering that. So I don't know. I marked a few places. I don't mean to just talk about things I marked, Rick. So is there anything? Let me see. I can ask you. Well, let's move on to the next dilemma because you mentioned the two dilemmas. I think it's in verse 16. Would you like to read verse 16?
Sure. 16. The second dilemma is whole versus special. The ego is not real. It's completely unaware that it is merely a temporary mechanism for soul growth. Therefore, the ego is anything but whole. An integrated body slash soul would be united and would produce a whole entity, a holy entity. And I'll add, this is what we've just been talking about, Christina. Since the soul is part of God, part of the source of everything, because none of this applies to 99.99% of humans, we must look at what does apply to them, which is specialness. Should I keep reading?
Yes, read the next two as well, 17 and 18, because it defines um, specialness. Keep going.
Okay. Specialness is how the ego evaluates itself and everyone else. It is a broad umbrella term that houses or categorizes. It can be both positive and negative. Someone can be cast into a category and remain there, or can shift from positive to negative, or vice versa. Someone who has been cast out can worm their way back in with showers of gifts and affection. The same person can be kicked to the curb if they fail to deliver the goods or fail to adequately compete with a third party who is vying for someone's attention and or affection. Specialness is the name of the game here, and it is bred from competition. The ego searches for others who will be loyal to it and will reward this loyalty. Virtually all friendships, business partnerships, and so called love relationships are based on specialness, not on wholeness, nor on unconditional love and acceptance.
Yeah, that describes it pretty well, doesn't it? The way the world works and the way we are taught to live in the world from the time we're children.
Yeah.
A lot of numbers are used to evaluate, you know.
I was struck with how it said that, some people are categorized, they're put in a box. Maybe the box is labeled bad. And maybe that person somehow gets redeemed and can be included again, or included people can be cast out and called bad. And I know for a fact that I've been cast out as bad so many times.
You're not kidding.
I don't
Me
think
too.
I Yeah, I don't think I was ever brought back in though. I think I pretty much stayed in that box.
I oh, we won't go there. That's another conversation which I probably prefer not to do on video. But yeah, I mean, just I've I feel like my whole life people have worked so hard to categorize me, and there's not been a box other than bad to put me in.
Yeah,
Not I don't mean family and friends and so on. I'm talking about the kind of work I've been doing, which has always been about the spaces in between. The world is not about the spaces in between. From the time I was 21 and started working in the tech industry, I've been all about the spaces in between, about systems and wholeness. And it's interesting because the word here that's being used is specialness and versus whole versus special. Wholeness is what it's always been about for me. But here's the interesting thing. Here's the tricky thing, and I think people have a little difficulty with this. Well, because wholeness is like oneness, also wholeness, oneness, all of it. But then people will say, well, what about me then? If it's oneness, then there's me and I'm unique. And so how can it be? And immediately we're in trouble because the world has taught us to think in binary, right? It's either this or this. And as in the first chapter, I was talking about both outside of time and inside of time. This is the same thing. It's not one or the other. Wholeness includes everything. So,
I
what do you say to
think
that?
it's a really hard thing to explain to anybody. I think you have to experience it yourself because I feel like I've become more accepting of all the different parts of myself and less judgmental and therefore more whole.
Mm-hmm.
And um, and I think that's an individual process, and one person's experience would be maybe not applicable at all to somebody else. But that is true, though, and I think that people will find that out as they go along
Mm-hmm.
in their own way. Yeah.
Yeah, they'll come to it in their own way, that's for sure. But one thing I will say, the mind is not the place to bring, not the way to get there, because the mind is trained. The brain, wants to categorize and separate out. That's the way the mind works, to make sense of everything. It's got to have logic to it. Um, and that's what, certainly dropping into the heart can be very helpful for taking a deep breath, and letting all those sharp, pointy thoughts kind of melt a little bit, soften and melt into the heart and kind of hang out there and feel, what does it mean to be whole and not special? Well, it's really not special, because everyone is special in their own unique way. And wholeness comprises all of that. But the world has taught us to comparison, and yet language is so hard. Language is so hard. And yet contrasting, you can contrast without comparing. You can contrast in wholeness by observing and having descriptive statements, not evaluatory statements. So there's no judgment, there's no comparison of better or worse. It's simply, this is red, this is blue, you know, these are peas, this is broccoli, it's just, but language is very limiting in that way. The language we have is, it's amazing how I find myself struggling to find language to describe something. And invariably, the person I'm speaking to assumes I'm evaluating and judging, and I'm not. I just love and celebrate difference of all kinds. And so I talk about it. But, in today's societies, even my kids will say, well, you shouldn't really be describing someone's skin color. Well, I do, because I find it so interesting and celebrate the different, unique distinctions that are all around, you know?
Yeah, that's a good point. This process, this awakening process that was mentioned today, does involve moving from brain orientation to more of the heart orientation, and more to a combination artfully using your brain
Mhm.
uh, to help you to get, to move around in this world. And that is important. And I think as that goes on, for me personally, I've become less concerned about identity, my identity. I am, whatever you say I am for you, but I can be lots of different things. And so I think that's been an interesting shift, is that movement from here to here is less defined,
Because the
and
heart is
it's
all about knowing in wholeness. The mind
right.
separates in order to understand and number and name and count, but the
Mhm.
heart knows in wholeness. you know
Mhm.
Heart feels the energy of it. And that's in a way, this is, I mean, the word energy was used right up front in chapter 1. I think this book is wonderful in the way it weaves together familiar words like fear and love and ego and so on, but it also brings in the word energy, because that's really what we are. And that's science. Human beings are electromagnetic fields, and the world is a field, and we're all these bundles of electrons. This is not made up, this isn't fantasy, it's scientific. So the fact that it's woven into a book like this, I think, is amazing, to think in terms of energy. And that's how, one way to understand wholeness versus specialness. Everything is energy, and energy can take any form. It can take any form, you know. Consciousness becomes form, concentrated form. Let's see. If I skip down to one more place, a couple more places I marked. Yeah, towards the end of this chapter in verse 23 and then a little bit later in 25, there was a sentence there that made me stop and reread it several times in verse 23. Let me just read that. It's a very short verse. I'll just read that. There are two truths about God in the world. The first is that God is everywhere, and that there is nowhere God isn't to be found. This is verse 23. The second is that the strength or potency of God on the earth is still relatively weak, whereas the strength of the ego is extremely strong, off the charts strong. With this understanding, one can see what the main problem is here. Well, after I got off the floor with my WTF reaction to that, it was like, what a crock we've been sold that God is all powerful if God is really relatively not powerful on the earth. And then I stopped and saw the phrase on the earth. What do you have to say about that?
Well, that's the third thing about these two chapters. The first thing was about God being something that grows, not a static thing. It's an energy that grows. And then the second thing was about Christ, the Christ within all of us, not just one person. And then this third thing about the fact that God's everywhere and yet God is not here in strong enough doses to make much of a difference. And so those are big, big ideas.
That last one, especially for me, certainly, And yet, the thing that's being said without being said explicitly, although maybe later on something will be said, is, and it's up to me to bring that through. I do have that power. So soul has that power to bring through that potency of God on the earth.
Maybe that's why we're doing this work, so that we can have more of that energy here on the earth. And so that's another reason why this is such a cool thing, that we get to learn about all of this and put it into action, because it's needed. I mean, it's good for us, to have a better understanding of ourselves and everybody else, but also if everybody can benefit from this, that would certainly be a good thing based on all the things that are going on, where it doesn't seem like there's any peaceful answer to it. It's just more conflict and blaming. And so and I think that this is important for ourselves, but also for everybody, for the world at large, for us to change our energy so that we can have more God here, uh, and a better experience for everybody.
That's sometimes a hard thing for people to truly get, that every moment of the day in ordinary things for myself or for my family or a friend, choosing that loving thought, choosing the blessing, choosing, to understand, choosing compassion, has a huge impact on the entire field, the entire world. It's not just happening here for myself or for the person next to me. It's happening for everyone. And that's powerful, if we remember that. It's not local, it's both local and universal. The effect of that, the ripples just keep going out, because the field is real. The quantum field, that's an energy that goes out there. So yeah, you're right. So, and there's billions of different paths to get to these feelings and these choices and clarity of what we're here for. And this is, I think, one very clear and straightforward and accessible way. And I'm glad that a lot of people are looking at it, each month. So glad you brought it through. It's a very great deal of generosity of time and energy and devotion while you're working full time, to do this as well. I guess we're coming up for the hour, so let me just look. I've got one more thing marked in verse 25. Yeah, I wrote down free will. I mean, that's a whole other conversation, but this whole thing about ego and choice, you know, there's sort of uh, it's unclear to me exactly. There is divine will. There is really only one will, but there sort of appears to be free will here as well, for choosing fear over love. Um, but I think it's only temporary when those things happen, you know. I just go around in circles until I choose love. And then something real happens. Then something real happens. So maybe would you like to conclude just by reading the last two verses?
Mm-hmm.
25 talks about that a little bit. And then 26 is the last verse in the chapter. Please.
Okay, 25. How does one change something which has no cohesive sense of purpose to something that does? How can the reality of God being here be reflected here in power and majesty? As it is now, the great life force itself plays second fiddle to the whims and desires of creatively thinking robots. Let's return to the initial intent of the Earth project. It was always intended as an intense pressure cooker to create more God energy. By eventually having all characters one day make the realization that they've been tricked into believing they are something that they are not. This is known as awakening, which is the opposite of being asleep or living in a dreamlike state. One can live on the earth in an illusionary or dreamlike state, or one can live on the earth in degrees of being awake. Everything from 4 a.m. grogginess to ultimate awareness is possible. Now is time for the latter. After millennia of illusion, now is the time for ultimate awareness about your true identity and what is truly going on here. Verse 26. This is Soul in the Driver's Seat, A Course in Miracles for the New Age. Unless you're okay with the confusion of not knowing who you really are and why you're here in a world of form, this is required reading. If you're okay with the status quo, this will be required reading for you when you're ready, and that time will be sooner rather than later. For the vast majority of people, now is the time to start a new adventure, which will lead to another new adventure, which will lead to another new adventure, all of which will peel away layers and layers of illusionary thought and will allow more and more of the true you to shine through. Be ready for tears, be ready for laughter, be ready to be confronted so you can take a hard look at what you have made. Keep what is real and allow what is illusionary to fade away, all while the real you gets stronger in the process.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, anything else you'd like to add, or
It was great talking to you, Christina.
you too? Thank you so much. You read wonderfully, so that was great that we got you on video doing that. So thank you, and keep up the good work. We keep going one moment at a time, right?
Yeah. Thank you, Christina. Have a good week ahead.
You too. Love you. Bye.